Okay. Hello. Okay. The word is start now. Well, I hope you're in for a treat. But the book that I'm writing, I have a goal to end it by, have it printed by the end of the year, but I think I'm slipping a little bit on my schedule. So I'm finding things that I need to improve. Getting ready for this, I found a number of things I needed to add and change. So, proud heritage, family, faith, friends, freedom. And life is about choices. The friends and home that you make, the spouse and the job you take. The autobiography is being written to commemorate for my family and posterity how this small town country nerd from East Texas, Pennsylvania, where there were more chickens than there were people. Second generation off the farm, first generation college educated, came to Timken as a sales engineer and retired after 40 years as executive vice president, chief operating officer, and president Bearings. And how this joy-filled life I lived making a difference by giving, sharing, loving, and caring helped make America the greatest country on earth. Proud heritage. My ancestors came to America in 1732 as indentured servants. I can trace my lineage back to the Reformation when man first printed. We're going to get into how that happened, but basically what I did find is my ancestors in Germany actually moved from a Catholic principality to a Lutheran principality so they could be Lutheran. And they helped fight in some of the wars too, I'm sure. I can trace the name back to Charlemagne's time because Charlemagne, when he took over in 900, he put a tax on people, and that tax had to have somebody to identify it. So my ancestors were from a village called Liper, which means proud man among the people in the German language, and they took the name Leibensperger. Other people took Millers and whatever, because they were millers. My heritage goes back to southwestern Germany 35,000 years ago. And what I mean there is I took one of these National Geographic swipes out of my genes and sent it in, and it came back that said I was part of Cro-Magnon man that left Africa about 35,000 years ago, went up through the Middle East, and then down into Germany, so they were there pretty early. And they put a timeline on that happening about 35,000 years ago. In the case of Donna, she was German too. Her name was Heine. She went directly, according to the National Geographic, she went directly north out of Africa, up through Spain into Germany. Now, the autobiography I've put into 4 sections. It's been said that significant changes occurred in the world when man first spoke. That's words, spoke words, and that's hunter-gathering world where they were hunter-gatherers, basically kind of just the first generation out of caves. When man first wrote words, the agrarian society and the Renaissance occurred. When man first printed words, the Reformation, Enlightenment, and the Industrial Revolution. And now in our watch, the word has been digitized, and that's where I basically was born, and you were born in the digital age. Now, I said life is about making choices, and I made a few good ones right at the start of my life. Going to college and becoming a mechanical engineer, marrying Donna, and going to work for Timken. The last 2 occurred all in the same time in June of 1960. Now, as an engineer, you're trained to develop know-how, solve problems, and create a new world. And a long time ago, I learned that when you try to solve a problem, you need to know the history to solve the problem and create that new world. So that's why I got interested in history, and my genealogy is my family, which I inherited from my great uncle and my father, the interest in genealogy. Anyway, what other things I found out is the brain has built in spirituality, Christian virtues, values, morality, likes and dislikes, left brain, right brain, and know-how. I'm going to be talking about a moral psychologist who wrote a very good book, and he identifies that the brain comes with built-in spirituality and morality. And I found it quite interesting, and we'll be talking about that. And then know-how, I think, is passed on from generation to generation, and if nurtured, can be improved upon. So heritage is the foundation of who I am. Now, I'm going to talk about my nurturing parents. My family was, I can't tell you how much attention I got from my parents. I can remember two things from my father, who never went to college, but from the time I can remember, he said, you're going to have to go to college. In the world you're living in, you're going to have to go to college. The second thing I remember him saying, you've got to give back more to the community than you take from it. And my father was a living example of volunteering and working in the community. From my mother, I was taught how to pray and made sure I got to church on Sunday mornings in Sunday school, and also that I got fed. And she was the one that kind of supervised my whereabouts during the day. I had always had to let my mother know where I was going, or when I came home and I hadn't let her know, and I was in trouble. So, Donna, church, work, community, friends were the additional contribution to my success in life. And what we're going to be talking about along the way, as I go through time, we're going to be talking about the great thinkers, world leaders, scientists, engineers, inventors, entrepreneurs, industrialists, and all the great movements that they initiated and companies that they launched. We're also going to be talking about right brain, left brain. I'm definitely was right brain, and Donna, our left brain, and Donna was right brain. Kurt took after his mother, and I was left with a grandson who took after me, and I want to talk about that. But what it says is right brain people are, left brain people are more analytical, more linear thinkers, and right brain people are more intuitive and more feeling emotional than the left brain folks. I have a friend who plays piano by ear. His mother could play by ear, and this guy is amazing. You just hum a classical tune or a current tune, he plays it. I mean, without music, he just plays it. His mother could do it, he could do it. His other sister and brother could not do it. None of Gary's children can do it, but his sister's children can. So, you know, that gene that, and I contend that there was a gene in that brain that recorded somebody back in time learned to play the piano. It just couldn't happen any other way. Now for my grandson. I retired, fortunately, when all my grandchildren, except Kristen, was born after I retired. But I retired in 2000, so Andrew was like 2 or 3 years old. When he was about 4 or 5, he had an Indian guide project that he wanted me to build a race car for. And so we went to the workshop, and first year I built it. The next year, when I got to the workshop to build the race car, Grandpa, I want to do it. Grandpa, I want to do it. And I started to leave him do it. And that started a relationship really from the time he was 6 or 7. In the summertime, when he was home from school, at least 2 or 3 times a week, I'd pick him up in the morning, have him for the rest of the day, and we'd work in the workshop. We'd polish cars, we'd work on cars. Within a relatively short period of time, whenever I gave him a tool to use, it was natural. I didn't have to show him how to hold it. It was just built into him, and I'm convinced that came from Grandpa. I used to tell him the night I'd take him home, I'd tell him what we're going to do the next day. So one day I told him we're going to work on the Lincoln car that I had, and we needed to change the light bulb in the tail light. And it was a little bit complicated. It wasn't straightforward. So I had Andrew there, and I explained to him. I said, Andrew, this is how we're going to do it, and this is what we have to do. I got all finished. And he said, why are we going to do it that way? And I said, well, how would you do it? And he told me, and I said, yeah, that's a better way. What he had done was gone on the internet and found a video showing how to change the light bulb in a '64 Lincoln. Now, today, he can do everything I can do, but he can do it better. And he tackles projects that I would have never tackled, but he uses the internet. Guess where I go for help when I need the internet, or when I need to do something on the internet? I go to him. So I'm convinced that there's something in your brain that takes that information, passes it on, and then builds upon it for the next generation. And that's kind of an important concept that I want to deal with, because as I trace my lineage from the beginning of time, caveman days through, I can see how each generation improved the way it did. It lived. Okay, then faith. I presented proof of God and creation, and this goes back to, obviously I went to church every Sunday, but in Sunday school till the time I went to college. Remember, my dad said, you got to go to college. Well, when we got to college, we had a lot of discussion about it. After hours, after we were sitting around not studying, when we probably should have been studying, we were talking about, is there a God? All about religion and had different viewpoints. I went home at Thanksgiving and started to espouse some of these at the dinner table at Thanksgiving, and I had my first Damascus Road experience. I think my father was having second thoughts about sending me to college. But anyway, my proof of God came fairly quickly after that when I was studying thermodynamics. The first law of thermodynamics says you can't create something from nothing. And I rang a bell and I said, well, how did we get here? So the guy that created something from nothing has to be special, and I call him God. And think about it. You know, the scientist says the world was created 13.8 billion years ago with the Big Bang. Where did the Big Bang come from? Well, they start with a plus and minus charge, and they mix it all together, and they blow it up, and that starts creating the periodic charts and matter and us and people. But then you have to have a place to put it. And then since the whole thing is based on evolution, you have to have time. Where did time come from? Where did the space come from? Where does the plus and minus charge come? There's got to be a God. So that's my proof of God. And anybody want to take me on that, I'm glad to do it. And that developed what I call dualism. And I don't call it that. That's the theory of dualism. You live in a binary world. Not only is that making you, but the way you behave. You know, pride or humility, love and hate, happy and sad, good and evil, capitalism, socialism, Democrats and Republicans. It's a binary world we're living in. So, the book introduction in the beginning, I start with the creation of God, and then I talk about how when you go down through the Bible, first day, second day, third day, fourth day, and people say, well, he can't create it in a day, but remember, he's just creating time. Time didn't exist, and you'll see later on, time, night and day may have changed, things like that. So that's the world we live in. Okay, so then I get into the next phase. When man first spoke, that happened about 35,000 years ago. The hunter-gatherers, when they went hunting, needed to signal each other, and they started to signal each other, and that's how words began to be formed. So it's the birth of modern man. They started to live in communities. Could have been still maybe in caves, but they had a body of people that lived together and had the same rights, same privileges, same interests. They had a religion. They started with a religion, but the religion and the rule and the ruler were one. The guy in charge of religion was the guy who was head of the clan, of that clan. Beginning of arts and music started then. Globalization started again. By that I meant if a family coming out of Africa, or a group, needed more food than when they went out hunting for it, they just moved on. And by the time the hunter-gathering stage was completed, we had neighbors in Noble's Pond 10,000 years ago. So that's how it moved around. There's no evidence that they ever warred with each other in hunter-gatherer days. But the men did the hunting and the women did the gathering, and everything was going along quite fine. Then the Great Flood came, and there's scientific evidence that that Great Flood occurred about 10,000 years ago. And of course, that chart over there is kind of interesting. We'll be talking more from that chart, but it compares secular history with biblical history. And I'm going to show, you know, everybody thinks the world began in, biblical history says it began 4,000 some years ago. Of course, secular history said 13.8 billion years ago. So you have this thing that people question, well, the Bible can't be right. I'm going to show you how the Bible history can correlate with secular history. So I'll be talking about that along the way. Now, when the agrarian era occurred, when they started to raise food, and incidentally, the women were the ones that started it all. When the flood came, it was hard to find food, and they learned they could plant seeds and let them grow. So the women are the ones that started the evolution to where we are today. And it's the beginning of social institutions, family, religion. They had didn't have medicine yet, sports, but that's the beginning of social industries evolves over time, and we'll be talking about that. They also began to develop know-how. The men started to figure out how to build shelters. And you know, when you look at, by the time you see recorded history, I mean, shelters with little roofs over them turned into pretty monumental things pretty early, like pyramids. And there's mysteries around building the pyramids that I'm going to be talking about as well. But they built amazing structures as time evolved. They also started to create wealth and sharing of it. They had to figure out how to create wealth, or they figured out how to create wealth, but then they had to figure out how to share it. I'll be talking about a book that's Wealth, Poverty, and Politics. Excellent book. It talks about the problems of sharing the wealth and how we generate and share the wealth and or the natural resources of nations results in conflicts between the haves and the have-nots. And this is the beginning of war. And then it talks about the problems of assimilation, how you take people that were living in Africa that migrated into different parts of China, and once they wanted to get back together again, they had evolved differently. And so adjusting to culture, you know, how Afro-Americans, when they came over here and as slaves, they came from an entirely different culture and had to fit in to our world. So we talk about that. Then agriculture, we talked about the irrigation, technology evolved, the wheel, craftsman, material. A lot of times it was developed for fighting, war purposes, just like it is today. You know, if you take that out to present day, the atomic bomb was created for war purposes, but we got a lot of benefits from it in our regular life. You get into leadership style, how different leaders develop. Some are benevolent, some are tyrannical, despotic, confrontational, narcissistic characteristics, charmistic. You talk about the beginning of capitalism very early. When they traded, they needed money to pay, so money was developed. And then I talk about weapons of war. I already mentioned that. Then we come to In Search of One God. You know, by the time we got to a certain point, there were all cultures were multiple gods. They had a god for everything. God for agriculture, God for whatever. So you see the early civilizations having many gods. And that is the beginning of Abraham and Moses, 10 Commandments, and so forth. So we'll talk a lot about that. The first great empire you know, they started with villages and then towns and then cities, and then the cities became nations. The first great empire came in the Middle East by Cyrus the Great in 559 BC. Alexander the Great, who came from Greece, brought the civilization to Greece and really was the one that defeated Cyrus, the Babylonian Empire. So, but you know, along the way, remember the Jews were in Babylon for a while as captives and all that, so we get into that. There was also, in Persia, there was one other thing developing in terms of one God besides the Jewish, and that was called Zoroastrianism. And they were actually ahead of Moses and in creating a monotheism, and that's where the three wise men came. In the history of they were from Persia and went to Bethlehem, which is like 550 miles, and I found that kind of fascinating. Now, in ancient Greek, we always say our culture is made up of influenced greatly by the Greek, the literature, their education, Greek philosophers, Plato. It's the foundation for science, sports, Olympics, democracy. They had the first democracy. So that all started in ancient Greece and then migrated west to Rome, into Europe, into America. Then we have the case for Christianity, which we know, birth of Christ, and Emperor Constantine finally, 500 years later, 300 years later, made it legal first. But salvation is more than following the law, is what the message of Christ is. It's giving, sharing, loving, and caring. We're going to be talking about the apostles and church fathers, how they spread that to Western civilization. Now, the ancient Asian culture was influenced differently than us. Confucius is the one who kind of gave that direction. And if you look at Buddhism and Hinduism, the religion focuses on the self, learning, creating a moral outlook, not being sinner. But both Buddhism and Hinduism is impacted by Confucius. And what it misses is the Christianity view of Christ said, Christ said there's more to life than following the law. There's giving, sharing, loving, and caring. So way back, we started to different thinking. Christianity, look at our missionaries, go over to that world to try to give, to help, make them better. That foundation, though, that was set with by Buddhism and Hinduism, I think is causing a lot of the problems as we're coming together. We developed differently over time. That part of the world, war was common. In Christianity, Augustine said there's only one just war, and that's if you're committing genocide like Hitler. So we talk about that. Now, Charlemagne was, after Christianity took hold, we entered the Dark Ages. And Charlemagne in 900 was the one that started to deal with that. He started the Renaissance and the thing called humanism. And humanism is removing all religious thinking in terms of how you approach the world. And that evolved over time from like 900 AD in the Renaissance into Martin Luther's time. So that alternate way of thinking about life was secular and Christian. Then comes, when man first printed, the Reformation. Freedom, entrepreneurship, separation of church and state, capitalism, and creation of wealth. The Industrial Revolution, the Enlightenment, questioning our social and economic systems. And sharing of the wealth, how we govern. So that's a whole new way of thinking, you know. And here we come to what's called the socio-economic systems. You know, examples of that would be tribalism. That's how it started in caves. Feudalism. That's most of what was practiced through Luther's time. Despotism as well. Capitalism was already there, but then in the Enlightenment, socialism and communism and a number of other things came up to muddy the water. But America, slavery, we're going to talk a little bit about that, the influence of the church and universities, and what America did that the rest of the world didn't do was it separated church and state. You know, even in Germany today, even though they have Christianity, the church is still run by the state. Matter of fact, if you declare yourself an atheist, you don't have to pay the church tax. They still have the church tax compared to us. And that led to freedom. Luther, when he posted the 95 Theses on the door, he wanted to have a debate. Took him a while, but he came up with a debate between a guy called Erasmus. And they argued over freedom. Luther talked about free will and how you didn't have to do works, you just had to accept grace, and you know, that was free will. And Erasmus was arguing more about political freedom. They both wrote books about it. They argued for 10, 15 years back and forth. But they were both right, because remember, the ruler and church were one. Up until Luther's time, the church was controlled by the head of the country, the head of state, the king, you know, divine right of kings. But Luther separated that, and I say he is the one that brought freedom to mankind through the Reformation. So then I go along and I give two examples of people who, you know, what happened in the Industrial Revolution, that freedom that was created, allowed people to think differently. So you have all these farm kids like me. Cornelius Altman was a farm kid in Paris, Ohio, who created Altman, and I give the history of that. Henry Timken was you know, he lived was born in Germany. His mother died, and they had like 4 or 5 kids. One of them was just a Lutheran minister. His brother was a Lutheran minister. But they came to America because they saw that they could practice things differently in America and live a different life in America. It was de Tocqueville who was the first to recognize that we evolved in a different way. He came over in 1830 and to study why was the American democracy and American Revolution successful in creating America, where the French Revolution was not. And he came to the conclusion that it was the way we practiced our religion, freedom of religion. And it really resulted in a multitude of churches. But that created a different environment in which people could operate. Then there was also a guy by another German, a German by the name of Max Weber. He came up with a Protestant work ethic, and his writings show that all the countries that went through the Reformation were the ones that were successful then in the world in the 1880s. And then we come, and I'm going to have to end this now. On our watch, when the word was digitized, I talk about my life in East Texas, growing up in East Texas with my nurturing parents and enjoying the digital world that Donna and I lived in. And then the bottom line was, in creating the digital world, the bottom line was at Timken Research, the people that we worked with capitalized on digital age technology to improve the performance of its steel and bearing products by orders of magnitude. And we talk about that. And I wrote when I retired, I wrote an article I gave a talk at a national, when I retired, the National American Bearing Manufacturers Association, ABA, had annual meetings in ASME. Fairly good-sized group of people met, probably 100 people were attending. They asked me to give a keynote speech of my experience in 40 years in the bearing world. And I did. And I played a little game and said, conquest of friction. I said, the bearing is what made the wheel work. And the fact that we were now able to get together and communicate and figure out how to live with each other, didn't have to fight wars anymore. Didn't have any world wars anyway. We had other scrimmages. But anyway, I wrote that. They asked me to write a paper afterwards, which I did, and it was published in ASME. And I felt pretty good about that. And then 9/11 occurred. And I said, whoops. So then I talk about all the things that have happened since 9/11. And then I end by calling for another Great Awakening. And these are the different Great Awakenings we had along the way. And we need to come back and get people coming back to church. Amen. Okay, so we're going to be going into depth on these sessions that you'll see. So, sorry it took me this long. Any comments, questions?
What was the fourth one you said for 1960 and 1980? What was that?
What's that?
The Fourth Awakening, 1960 and 1980. What was that one?
I think it had to do with the use of like the Billy Graham churches.
Oh, the mega churches.
The mega churches, yeah, and the use
That makes sense.
of technology to spread the gospel. Yeah. I'm gonna actually talk about those. But the first one was when it was around when the revolution was, And after the Revolution, you know, people were migrating west, and they weren't bringing the church along. And that's the Methodist circuit riders. That's where that was the solution to getting people back to church. You know, people would maybe get to church like once every 3 months or something. And so the Methodists came up with the idea of circuit riders and building churches. Matter of fact, my ancestors, after they served their indenture, they moved to a place called Maxitani, and he somehow ended up with like 280 acres of land, and he had 3 sons, and when he was ready to pass on, he split the area into 3 farms, and they had a grist mill that they could make flour in one, and they also attended a church that was probably by horse and buggy, probably 20 miles away, was the closest church. And he built not the original ancestor, one of the sons built the first church at Maxitani, which was like a walk from their homes in 1828. And so I think that was part of the Great Awakening. So, okay.
Thanks.
So next week we'll start chapter 1.